The moment Delia Doyle stepped off the train at Caldwell Station, she knew with cold certainty in the pit of her stomach that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The sign above the platform read Harlan's Crossing, Kansas, not Millbrook, which was the name of the town she had memorized like a prayer during the long, rattling journey west from Cincinnati. She stood on the weathered wooden platform with her single leather trunk at her feet and a carpet bag clutched in both hands, the August heat of 1882 pressing down on her like a warm, unwelcome hand. Dust drifted across the platform in lazy spirals. A dog barked somewhere down the main street. The train hissed and groaned behind her as if apologizing, then lurched forward and rolled on without her, leaving nothing but a disappearing plume of smoke and the sound of her own heartbeat. She had fallen asleep somewhere past the junction. She had been so desperately tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after weeks of uncertainty and anticipation, and she had simply closed her eyes for what she thought was a moment. When she opened them, the conductor was calling Caldwell Station, and the woman across from her was already gathering her parcels, and Delia had assumed incorrectly, catastrophically, that this was her stop. She pressed her lips together and turned to face the town stretched out before her. Harlan's Crossing was not a large place. A main street of hard-packed red dirt ran through the middle of it, lined on either side with buildings of varying ambition, a dry goods store, a livery stable, a saloon with a painted sign that was peeling at the corners, a small post office, a barber shop, a church at the far end with a white steeple that caught the afternoon light. It was a proper town, or at least the bones of one, but it was not Millbrook, and the man waiting for her in Millbrook was a cattle rancher named Gerald Holt, who had corresponded with her for 6 months through a matrimonial agency back in Cincinnati. Delia pulled Gerald's last letter from her carpet bag and read the address she had memorized again just to be sure she had not dreamed it. Millbrook, Kansas. She had not dreamed it. She was simply in the wrong place. She was 24 years old, alone on a train platform in a town she had never heard of, with $43 in her purse, and a letter of introduction addressed to a man who did not know she was not coming. Her mother had died 2 winters ago. Her father had remarried quickly, a woman who made it plain that the house on Plum Street was no longer quite large enough for a grown daughter with opinions. The matrimonial agency had seemed like a reasonable solution, not a romantic one exactly, but a practical one. Gerald Holt's letters had been brief but not unkind. He wrote that he needed a capable woman to manage his household, that he ran a clean operation, and that he was not a drinking man. It was not poetry, but it was something to hold on to. Now she was holding nothing but a carpet bag and the oppressive weight of her own miscalculation. "Ma'am." The voice came from her left, and she turned to find a man standing at the edge of the platform steps. He had apparently been there for some time, watching her with a patient, unhurried expression that she found both steadying and slightly unnerving. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the way some men seem tall simply, because they carried themselves with bluster, with broad shoulders that filled out a faded blue chambray shirt and dark canvas trousers tucked into worn leather boots. He had a brown hat pushed back on his head, and a face that had been lived in by wind and sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often and squinted into the distance even more often. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, and his jaw carried a few days of shadow. He was, she noticed with an instinct she immediately tried to set aside, quite handsome in the way that useful things sometimes were, solid and weathered and built for the actual world. He was holding his hat in his hands now. He had taken it off, she realized, which was a gesture of courtesy so quietly performed that she had almost missed it. "You look like you might be in a spot of trouble," he said. His voice was low and even, a Kansas voice, soft around the consonants. Delia straightened her spine, which was a reflex she had developed in childhood and had never managed to cure herself of. "I am in somewhat of a predicament," she said carefully, because there was no earthly use in lying about it. "I appear to have disembarked at the wrong station." The man nodded slowly, as if this information fit neatly into a theory he had already been forming. "Were you bound for Millbrook?" She blinked. "How did you know that?" "Well," he said, a small careful smile touching his mouth, "we get maybe 1 or 2 passengers a month come through Caldwell Station, and when I drove up with the supply wagon just now, you were standing there looking at that letter like it had personally offended you. Millbrook is 2 stops east. Easy to sleep past it on a hot day." He paused. "The name's Ralph Barker. I own a cattle spread about 4 miles north of here. I came in to collect some wire and flour from the freight wagon." He nodded toward a broad-backed roan horse hitched to a flat wagon near the station house. "Were you being met in Millbrook?" Delia hesitated only a moment. There was nothing to be gained from evasiveness when she needed information and possibly help. "I was expected there, yes. By a Mr. Gerald Holt. I am his. I was arranged to be his bride." She said it simply, the way you state a fact rather than a feeling. "I am Delia Doyle." Ralph Barker looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not pity, not amusement, something quieter and more considered. "Miss Doyle," he said, "do you want to send a wire to Millbrook and let Mr. Holt know where you've ended up? The telegraph office is just there next to the post office. Ben Marsh keeps it open until 6 o'clock. Can I get a train back east from this station?" she asked, because she needed to understand all her options before she committed to any of them. "Next eastbound doesn't come through until Thursday. It's Monday now. 3 days." She had 3 days to spend in a town she had never planned to visit, and $43 standing between her and disaster. She looked at the main street of Harlan's Crossing and then back at Ralph Barker, who was still holding his hat and looking at her with that unhurried steadiness, as if he had nowhere pressing to be and no intention of making her feel rushed or foolish. "Then yes," she said, "I would appreciate knowing where the telegraph office is." He walked her there himself, carrying her trunk without asking permission, which under different circumstances she might have found presumptuous. She found it instead simply practical, because the trunk was heavy and the platform boards were uneven, and his offer had been implicit in the way he lifted it before she could protest. He carried it as if it weighed nothing, which told her something about the kind of work his days were built from. The telegraph office smelled of ink and metal. The operator, Ben Marsh, was a compact man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who took her message down carefully. She dictated it briefly. She had missed her stop. She was in Harlan's Crossing. She would arrange to reach Millbrook within the week. She paid the small fee and folded the receipt into her bag. When she stepped back outside, Ralph Barker was leaning against the post supporting the awning of the telegraph office, looking down the main street with the relaxed attention of a man comfortable in his own skin. The afternoon light was going golden at the edges. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked. "There is. Mrs. Ida Perkins runs it on the far side of the church. Clean place, good food. She charges $1 a night and she doesn't tolerate nonsense." He paused. "I'll walk you over if you like. I need to stop at the dry goods store on the way anyway." She fell into step beside him. Harlan's Crossing was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but simply unhurried. A pair of men sat outside the saloon on barrel chairs, playing cards without enthusiasm. A woman in a gray dress was shaking dust from a rug out an upstairs window. 2 boys ran past chasing a hoop and paid Delia and Ralph no attention whatsoever. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, because silence between strangers in close proximity always felt wasteful to her. 8 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri in '74 with 40 head of cattle and a mule named Solomon who had an opinion about everything. Started with nothing much and built it up piece by piece." He said it without pride, just as fact, which she respected more than boasting would have been. "It's a modest operation. 400 acres now, about 200 head, 2 hired hands, Milo and Pete, good men both. I grow enough wheat on the east quarter to supplement through the winter." "You live alone?" she asked, and then immediately wondered if that was too direct. He glanced at her sideways briefly and the small smile returned. "I do now. My wife passed 4 years ago. fever in the winter of '78. He said it quietly, the way people say things they have made their peace with but still carry. We had no children. I'm sorry, Delia said, and meant it without embellishment. Thank you, he said simply. They arrived at the dry goods store and Ralph held the door for her. She waited near the front counter while he spoke briefly with the proprietor, a heavy-set man named Abe Fletcher who clearly knew Ralph well and greeted him with the cheerful familiarity of long acquaintance. Ralph ordered flour, coffee, a spool of wire, and a box of cartridges, then carried 2 of the bags out to his wagon before returning for the wire. The boarding house is just ahead, he said when he came back. I'll take you there and then I need to head back out to the ranch before dark. Delia nodded. As they walked the last half-block to Mrs. Perkins' door, she found herself noticing small things about Ralph Barker. The careful way he stepped to the outside of the boardwalk so she had the shelter of the awnings. The way he set her trunk down gently rather than dropping it. The way he spoke to her as if she were a capable adult who had simply encountered an inconvenient circumstance, rather than a foolish woman who deserved whatever trouble she'd wandered into. It was a small thing. It struck her nonetheless. Mrs. Ida Perkins was a round-faced woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Delia liked immediately. She had a room available on the 2nd floor that overlooked the church, small but clean, with a washstand and a window that caught the evening breeze. She confirmed the rate of $1 per night and told Delia that supper was at 6 o'clock and breakfast at 7, and she didn't heat the stove outside those hours, but there was always water and the privy was in good repair. Ralph set the trunk inside the front door and turned to Delia with his hat in his hands again. Miss Doyle, he said, I hope things work out smooth from here. If there's anything you need while you're in town, Abe Fletcher at the dry goods knows everybody and he's a decent man. Thank you, Mr. Barker, she said. You've been very kind. Genuinely. He nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and walked out into the cooling afternoon. Delia watched him go from the doorway for a moment, noting the unhurried length of his stride, the way he lifted a hand to a man across the street without breaking step. Then she turned back to Mrs. Perkins and asked if she might wash her face before supper. She lay awake for a long time that night in the small, clean room, listening to the sounds of Harlan's Crossing settling into its evening. A horse moving slowly down the main street, someone playing a harmonica somewhere distant and sweet, the creak of the boarding house roof in the light wind. She thought about Gerald Holt in Millbrook, waiting for a woman who hadn't arrived. She thought about the train and the heat and the foolishness of falling asleep. She thought briefly and with no particular agenda about Ralph Barker's steady brown eyes and the quiet way he had said she passed 4 years ago, carrying it like something real and not merely a conversational detail. She slept eventually and did not dream. The next morning arrived bright and blazing, the Kansas sky a hard blue that looked as if it had been polished. Delia came down to breakfast to find Mrs. Perkins' table occupied by 2 other boarders, a traveling salesman named Mr. Coop who sold patent medicines out of a large leather case and talked about himself with exhausting relentlessness, and a quiet surveyor named Henderson who nodded politely and returned to his biscuits. Delia ate well eggs, salt pork, biscuits with sorghum, strong coffee, and felt measurably more stable than she had the night before. After breakfast, she walked out into the morning to think. She had expected a reply wire from Millbrook by mid-morning and went to check with Ben Marsh at the telegraph office. There was a reply waiting for her, and she unfolded it with steady hands. The message was from Gerald Holt. It was brief even by the standards of telegraph brevity. It read, "Arrangements cannot wait. Found another arrangement. Consider yourself released from obligation." She read it twice. Then she folded it neatly along its original creases, placed it in her bag, and walked back out into the sunlit street of Harlan's Crossing with a sensation she identified, after a moment's internal examination, not as grief but as something closer to relief wearing the clothes of shock. Gerald Holt had found another arrangement. in less than 24 hours. Which meant, she realized with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that he had not been waiting for her specifically. He had been waiting for anyone suitable who would arrive on time and manage his household without complaint. She had been a practical solution to him, as he had been to her, but she had at least been willing to make an honest effort of it. The fact that he had replaced her with the speed of a man replacing a broken wagon wheel told her something important about what her life in Millbrook might have looked like. She stood in the street and looked at the blue sky above the rooftops of Harlan's Crossing and thought, with great deliberate calm, about what came next. She had $42 remaining. She'd spent $1 on the wire and $1 on the first night's lodging. She had a trunk full of clothes and household linens she had been assembling for months in anticipation of married life. She had no job, no prospect, and no immediate destination. The next eastbound train was Thursday. She could go back to Cincinnati and face her stepmother's smug satisfaction and the narrow bed in the back room that was offered to her with such pointed charity. Or she could consider whether there was another option she hadn't thought of yet. She was so occupied with this internal reckoning that she very nearly walked directly into Ralph Barker, who was coming out of the post office with a bundle of mail under his arm. He caught her by the elbow automatically, steadying her. "Miss Doyle." He released her elbow immediately, which she also noticed. "Good morning. I didn't expect to see you still in town." "I received a communication this morning," she said. She was not entirely sure why she told him, except that his expression was so absent of anything but genuine concern. "Mr. Holt in Millbrook has made other arrangements. He has, in short, found himself a different bride." Ralph looked at her steadily for a moment. "I see," he said, and his voice was careful with it, neither overreacting nor minimizing. "Are you all right?" "I'm thinking," she said honestly. "I find I'm more all right than I expected to be." Something in his expression shifted then, something faint and considered. "Do you have plans for the morning?" he asked. "I have no plans for anything whatsoever," she said, "which is the problem I'm currently turning over." "I have an errand to run at the mill at the edge of town," he said. "It's a 15-minute walk. If you'd care for some air and company, you're welcome to it. No obligation either way." She considered him for a moment. He was not attempting to solve her problem or steer her toward any particular decision. He was simply offering her a walk on a bright morning. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you." They walked east along the main street and then down a dirt lane that cut through a stand of cottonwood trees toward the mill, which sat beside a narrow creek that ran surprisingly clear for August. The miller, a man named Cray, had a small order of ground cornmeal that Ralph had arranged the previous week. While Ralph dealt with that, Delia sat on a wooden bench beside the creek and watched the water move over the stones. She heard Ralph's boots on the soft ground before he sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a proper and respectful distance between them. "Can I ask you something directly?" she said. "You can ask me anything you like," he said. "Do you know of any work available in Harlan's Crossing? For a woman, I can teach school. I have 2 years of normal school training from Cincinnati. I can cook well, I can keep books, I am competent with a needle and thread, and I can manage a household efficiently. I'm trying to understand what my options are before I decide whether to go back east." Ralph was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. It was becoming, she realized, a habit of his, the hat turning, the quiet thinking before speaking. She found she liked it. It meant he was actually considering what she had said rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. "There's been talk in town," he said finally, "about the schoolteacher situation. Mrs. Dobbins taught the school here for 6 years, but she married a man from Wichita in the spring and went with him. The school board hasn't found a replacement yet. The children have been without a teacher since April." He paused. "The board chairman is Reverend Calhoun, the white church at the end of the street. He's a reasonable man." Delia looked at the creek for a moment. Teaching school. It was what she had trained for, actually, before the plan had shifted toward marriage. She was good at it. She had substitute taught in Cincinnati for a year before her mother died, and the household had needed her more than the schoolroom had. "Where would I find Reverend Calhoun?" she asked. "He'll be at the church this morning," Ralph said. "He always is on Tuesdays, does his correspondence and his sermon preparation." She stood up. Ralph stood immediately too. "Would you show me the way?" she asked. "I'll walk you back to the church," he said simply. Reverend Calhoun turned out to be a thin, energetic man in his 60s with white hair and a quick, intelligent manner that Delia found bracing and refreshing after a morning of uncertainty. He interviewed her on the spot in the front pew of the small church, asking about her training and her methods and her opinion on the uses of memorization versus comprehension in teaching arithmetic. And he listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who took education seriously. At the end of half an hour, he told her that the school board met on Thursday evening and that he would put her name before them, but that in his own estimation she was eminently qualified, and he anticipated no difficulty. The board met Thursday, as he had promised, and they voted to hire Miss Delia Doyle as the teacher of Harlan's Crossing School at a salary of $30 per month, with the schoolhouse to open on the first Monday of September, which was 3 weeks away. Delia shook Reverend Calhoun's hand and thanked each of the 5 board members with the composed warmth of a woman who understood that gratitude should be genuine rather than excessive. She sent a letter to Cincinnati rather than a wire. It was cheaper, and the situation no longer required urgency. She told her father where she was and that she had found employment and that she was well. She did not mention Gerald Holt's letter. She did not mention Ralph Barker either, because there was nothing to mention, not yet. She let the boarding house room for the month, negotiating with Mrs. Perkins a slightly reduced rate in exchange for helping with breakfast preparations 4 mornings a week, which suited them both. Mrs. Perkins, she discovered, was a woman of considerable intelligence and dry humor who had been widowed 15 years ago and had built the boarding house herself, room by room, with the insurance money and sheer stubbornness. Delia liked her enormously. Ralph Barker came into town twice that week, once for supplies and once to collect a piece of machinery that had come in on the freight wagon, and both times he stopped to speak with her if he saw her on the street, which he did. Their conversations were easy without being trivial. He told her about the ranch, describing the particulars of his cattle operation with the specificity of a man genuinely interested in what he did rather than simply filling silence. She told him about Cincinnati, about her mother, about the normal school, and the year she had taught in the city's 4th Ward, where the children had come from every corner of Europe and spoken a collective babel of languages she had found wonderful rather than daunting. On Friday evening, as she was walking back from the general store with a paper parcel of writing supplies she planned to use to prepare her school lessons, she heard her name called and turned to find Ralph Barker on horseback, coming down the main street with the easy seat of a man born to it. He reined in beside her and tipped his hat. "Miss Doyle, are you finding your way around all right?" "Quite well," she said, smiling up at him. "I've managed to locate everything I need, which isn't much. It's a manageable town." He swung down from the horse, a smooth movement without showmanship, and fell into step beside her, leading the horse by the reins. "I heard the school board hired you," he said. "Word travels fast in a small town." "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. "Does it bother you, the speed of it?" "Not especially," he said. "It means people know each other, which has more use than it has cost." He paused. "I wanted to say, and I hope this isn't forward, that I think it's a good thing for the children here. They've been without a teacher 4 months, and it shows. Milo's youngest boy has fallen behind in his reading, and he's been fretting about it." "Milo is your hired hand," she said. "One of them. He and his wife Loretta have 4 children. Good family. They live in the small house on the south end of my property." He paused again. "I was wondering, there's a picnic on Sunday after church. The whole town turns out. It would be a good chance to meet people before the school opens, if you were inclined." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead down the street, leading the horse, very carefully not looking at her, and she recognized in that careful non-looking exactly what it meant. He was asking her to accompany him and doing it sideways, offering her the event rather than himself, giving her the exit if she wanted it. She did not want it. "I would be glad to go," she said. He looked at her then, and the small, careful smile appeared. "Good," he said simply. "Church starts at 10. The picnic's right after on the green beside the church." The Sunday picnic was the kind of event that small Kansas towns did beautifully, tables of food stretching under cottonwood trees, children running barefoot through the grass, men grouped around the edges discussing weather and cattle prices, women moving between conversations, with the efficient sociability of people who genuinely needed each other. Ralph introduced Delia to everyone with a steadiness that was neither possessive nor indifferent. She was the new school teacher, he said, and she had come from Cincinnati. The community received her with the mixture of curiosity and warmth that she was learning was characteristic of Harlan's Crossing. She met Milo Crane, Ralph's hired man, a compact, red-haired man of about 35 with a broad grin and hands calloused to leather, and Loretta Crane, a cheerful, practical woman who immediately took Delia's arm and introduced her to 6 more women in the space of 10 minutes. She met Pete Dawson, Ralph's other hand, a quiet man of 40 who said very little but said it precisely. She met the Fletchers and the Marshes and the school board members' wives and the doctor, a young man named Calloway who had come out from St. Louis 2 years ago and was still slightly startled by dust storms. She and Ralph sat together on a blanket under a large cottonwood with their plates of food: cold chicken, potato salad, cornbread, 2 kinds of pie, and the conversation between them moved with the ease of something that had been moving all week without quite acknowledging where it was going. He talked about the history of the land hereabouts, about the Cheyenne who had moved through this territory in the years before the cattle drives changed everything. And he spoke about it without the casual dismissiveness that she had heard from so many men who treated the displacement of whole peoples as simply the natural order of things. He said it plainly. It had been their land before it was anyone else's, and the way it had been taken was a thing a decent person had to reckon with, not explain away. She found, sitting beside him on that blanket in the August sun with cottonwood leaves drifting slow and golden overhead, that she was looking at the fact of Ralph Barker, this actual specific man, not an idea of what a Western rancher might be, and finding him not merely decent but genuinely, quietly remarkable. She was not, she told herself carefully, going to be foolish about it. She had arrived in this town entirely by accident. She had a job now and a plan and a path forward that did not require a man at the center of it. She was not going to attach herself to the first kind person she encountered simply out of gratitude and displacement. She told herself this with great conviction all afternoon while sitting beside him and laughing at the same things and watching his hands when he talked about the wheat field and the particular yellow it turned in September. The weeks before school opened moved quickly and purposefully. Delia threw herself into preparation with the concentration of a woman who understands that work is both purpose and armor. She cleaned the schoolhouse from floor to ceiling with the help of Loretta Crane, who showed up on Tuesday morning with a bucket and a broom, and the information that the school board had told her the new teacher might need a hand, and she intended to be that hand. They scrubbed and aired and arranged. Delia made a list of what supplies she needed and presented it to Reverend Calhoun, who worked with Abe Fletcher to have it ordered from Wichita. Ralph came by the schoolhouse on Wednesday afternoon while she was oiling the hinges of the door, which had been squeaking since she first opened it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the cleaned room and the neat rows of desks and the slate board she had already chalked a welcoming message onto, and something in his expression was very warm and quiet. "It looks good," he said. "It's beginning to," she agreed, setting down the oilcloth. "What brings you to town on a Wednesday?" "Needed a new bit for the drill," he said, and I thought I'd check on how the schoolhouse was coming along." He paused. "There's something I want to ask you, Miss Doyle, and I want to ask it plainly." She looked at him with the calm attention she gave to things that mattered. "All right," she said. He was doing the hat thing again, turning it in his hands. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I know you've had a complicated arrival here, and I know you're settling into something new, and I don't want to complicate your life or rush anything. But I find that I think about you a great deal, and I respect you too much to do that quietly without saying so." He stopped and looked at her directly, which took, she thought, a genuine kind of courage. "If you have no interest in that, I will take it like a man and we can remain friendly acquaintances and I'll never raise it again. But I wanted to be honest with you." Delia looked at him for a long, steady moment. She thought about Gerald Holt's wire, "Consider yourself released from obligation," and the absence of anything in it that resembled the word care. She thought about a man who turns his hat in his hands because he is nervous, not because he wants to appear nervous. She thought about the Sunday picnic and the cottonwood leaves and the particular way he listened, as if what she was saying was actually the most interesting thing in the immediate vicinity. "I would like that," she said, "to be courted properly, yes." The smile that crossed his face was not small this time. It was full and real and slightly surprised, as if he had braced himself for a different answer. "Then I'll be calling on you Saturday," he said, "if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. He settled his hat back on his head. "Saturday," he said, and walked back out into the afternoon, and she watched him go with a warmth in her chest that she did not attempt to explain away this time. Courting Ralph Barker turned out to be one of the most genuinely interesting experiences of Delia Doyle's life, which she had not anticipated, because she had not expected a man of such quiet exterior to contain such a rich and attentive interior. He called on Saturday as he had promised, arriving at the boarding house at 2 in the afternoon with his hat in hand, and a small bunch of wildflowers he had clearly picked from beside the road, because they were slightly wilted and not at all arranged, and she liked them better for it than she would have liked a formal bouquet. He asked Mrs. Perkins' permission to take Delia for a drive, which made Mrs. Perkins give him a look of frank approval that she made no attempt to conceal. He drove her out to the North Road in his wagon, and she sat beside him on the bench seat and watched the Kansas landscape open up around them. The great flat expanse of it, the sky so huge it made her feel simultaneously small and expanded, the gold of the late summer grass stretching to the horizon, with only the dark shapes of occasional cottonwood groves breaking the line. It was nothing like Cincinnati, which was a city of hills and rivers and the constant noise of industry and people, and she found to her surprise that she did not miss it the way she thought she would. "This is where the land changes," Ralph said, pulling the wagon to the top of a slight rise. He stopped the horse and they sat looking north, where the grassland rolled away in long sweeping waves in the late afternoon light. "There's a creek 3 miles that way that has cottonwoods along it for half a mile. In September the leaves go yellow all at once. You'll be able to see it from the schoolhouse on a clear day." "Do you love it?" she asked. "This land?" He was quiet for a moment, as if taking the question seriously. "I think it's the realest thing I've ever known," he said finally. "It doesn't pretend to be something other than what it is. The sky doesn't negotiate. The weather doesn't apologize. There's something honest about that." He paused. "I know that might sound strange." "It sounds exactly right," she said. They drove back in the long gold light of early evening, and the conversation drifted from the land to books. He had read more than she had expected, requesting volumes from the Wichita catalog and keeping them in a bookcase in the room he called, without irony, the front room of the ranch house, and from books to music, about which they disagreed pleasantly and at some length, she defending the piano sonata and he making a serious case for the fiddle. And the disagreement was so enjoyable that neither of them was particularly interested in resolving it. He walked her to Mrs. Perkins' door at dusk and stood on the step with his hat in his hands. "I'd like to do this again next Saturday," he said, "if you'll allow it." "I'll allow it," she said. "Good evening, Miss Doyle." "Good evening, Mr. Barker." She went upstairs and sat by the window in the last of the light and admitted to herself, fully and without qualification, that she was falling for this man. The admission did not frighten her the way she might have expected. It felt instead like a thing that had been happening for some time that she was simply now putting the correct name to. School opened on the first Monday of September, and the 17 children of Harlan's Crossing filed into the freshly cleaned schoolhouse with the mixture of excitement and terror that children bring to new situations. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, and their abilities ranged equally widely, which was the central challenge of a one-room school and also, Delia found, its particular reward. She divided them into groups and moved between them with the focused energy of someone who genuinely loved this work. And by the end of the first week, she knew all their names and their particular difficulties, and the subjects that lit them up. Milo's youngest, a boy of 8 named Clarence who had been worrying about his reading, turned out to have a gift for arithmetic that she identified immediately and cultivated with relish. She sent a note home with him telling Loretta that Clarence was one of the brightest children she'd encountered, and that his reading would come along directly with some particular attention to the phonics method she planned to introduce. Loretta appeared at the schoolhouse the next morning, with a jar of blackberry preserves and tears in her eyes that she pretended were from the dust. Ralph came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in mid-September on the pretext of checking whether the window latch she had complained about was sticking. It was, and he fixed it in 10 minutes with a screwdriver and some mutual discussion, while the children watched him with the frank curiosity of children who are not quite sure whether to find an adult visitor interesting or alarming. He spoke to them naturally and without condescension and showed Clarence how the screwdriver's mechanism worked, which Clarence found deeply satisfying from a mechanical principles standpoint. After the children had gone home and the schoolhouse was quiet, Ralph sat on the edge of one of the desks while Delia graded arithmetic papers at her own desk, and the easy, comfortable silence between them was the kind that she recognized, had always recognized theoretically, not from experience, as the best kind. The kind where two people are fully present in the same room without needing the room to be filled. "Can I ask you something?" she said without looking up from the papers. "You've asked me that before," he said, "and you always ask something worth asking." She looked up at that. He was watching her with the warmth that was becoming familiar, the particular way he looked at her that she had no adequate vocabulary for except that it made her feel seen rather than examined. "Do you think about the future?" she asked. "The specific shape of it, what you want it to look like?" He was quiet for the length of one long breath. "Yes," he said, "more since you arrived in this town than I had in the 4 years before it." She set down her pencil. "That is a significant thing to say." "I mean it significantly," he said. She looked at him across the quiet room with its chalk smell and its afternoon light and its rows of small, empty desks, and she thought about the train and the heat and the wrong stop, and how completely arbitrary it had all been, the moment of sleep, the missed junction, the platform sign, and how that arbitrary chain had delivered her here, to this specific place and this specific man, and how little of it she would change. "Ralph," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, which he registered with a slight stillness. "I think you should know that when I stepped off that train into the wrong town, I was frightened and embarrassed and completely at sea. And within the first hour, you managed to make me feel like a person who had simply had a difficult afternoon rather than a fool who had ruined her own life. I have never forgotten that." He was very still. "Delia," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard before from anyone, a quality of care so unguarded it was almost startling. "I knew from the moment I saw you on that platform that you were someone I wanted to know. I didn't say that then because it would have been wildly inappropriate." She laughed, and he smiled, the full genuine smile. "I'm saying it now," he said, "because it's true and because I think we have gone past the point where it's inappropriate, and because I have not been a man who says the important things late in life, and I'm not going to start." She came around from behind her desk and crossed the room to him, which was, she thought later, the bravest thing she had done since stepping onto that platform without knowing where she was. She stood directly in front of him and looked up at him. He was tall enough that even sitting on the desk edge he was nearly at her height, and said, "I am in love with you. I believe I have been for some weeks, and I have been arguing with myself about it, which was foolish, and I've decided to stop." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no precise name for, only that it was full and warm and entirely unguarded. Then he reached up and took her hand, carefully, as if it were something precious, which was exactly how she wanted to be held. "I am entirely, completely in love with you," he said. "And I would very much like to ask you to marry me, but I want to do that properly and not in a schoolroom, so I'm asking you to allow me some time to do it right." "How much time?" she said, smiling. "3 days," he said. "I can manage 3 days," she said. He kissed her hand, which made her breath catch in a way she had not anticipated, and then released it with the same care he'd picked it up with. He came to Mrs. Perkins' boarding house 3 days later on a Thursday evening, which was not a designated visiting day, which made Mrs. Perkins raise both eyebrows when she answered the door, and then lower them into an expression of pleased approval when she saw what Ralph was holding, a small bunch of actual flowers this time, not wilted, cut from Loretta Crane's garden at the ranch's south house, late-season asters in purple and white. He asked Mrs. Perkins very formally if he might speak with Miss Doyle in the parlor, and Mrs. Perkins said yes, and then positioned herself in the adjacent room with the door left slightly ajar in the most technically appropriate and thoroughly attentive way possible. Delia came down the stairs and found him in the parlor, holding the flowers, and the sight of him in the lamplight. This man she had not known existed 8 weeks ago. This man she had found entirely by sleeping past a train stop made something in her chest go warm and absolute. He gave her the flowers. He said her name once, carefully. He said that he had spent 36 years on this earth, and that he had loved and lost and built things up from nothing, and that he had become, through all of it, a man who knew very precisely the difference between what was real and what was merely convenient. He said that she was the most real thing that had walked into his life in many years, and that he had no interest in letting her walk back out of it, and that he understood she had come here by accident and had her own plans and her own competence, and did not need him for any practical purpose, and that he hoped she might want him anyway, for all the impractical ones. He asked her to be his wife. She said yes before he had fully finished the sentence. Mrs. Perkins in the next room made a sound that she immediately covered with a cough. The engagement moved through Harlan's Crossing with the speed of genuinely good news in a small town, which is very fast indeed. By the next morning, Loretta Crane had appeared at the boarding house with a pound cake. By afternoon, Reverend Calhoun had congratulated Delia in the street and told her that he would be honored to perform the ceremony. By the weekend, 3 women Delia had not yet fully met had offered opinions on flowers. Ralph drove out to the ranch after the engagement was settled with a feeling in his chest that he had not known in 4 years, and had been fairly certain he would never know again. Not happiness exactly, though it was that too, but something more specific and rarer, which was the feeling of the future being a place he actively wanted to arrive at. He told Milo and Loretta at their small house at the south end of the property, and Loretta clasped her hands together and said she had known it was coming for 3 weeks, and that Milo owed her a pair of new boots because she had won the wager. Milo paid up without complaint and shook Ralph's hand for a long time. There was one thing Delia had to address before the wedding, and she addressed it directly as she did most things. She wrote Gerald Holt a brief, civil letter, not to recriminate but to close the account properly. She thanked him for his correspondence over the previous months, noted that she understood he had made other arrangements and that she had done the same, and wished him well in his marriage. She did not write it from spite or bitterness, but from the sense that a chapter ought to be properly closed before you begin the next one. She received no reply, which was fine. The point had never been the reply. She wrote her father a much longer letter describing everything: the wrong stop, the town, Ralph Barker, the school, the engagement. And in it, she was honest enough to say that she had arrived in Kansas afraid and had somehow stumbled into exactly the life she had not known she was looking for. Her father's reply came 2 weeks later. It was the most warmly he had written to her in years, perhaps since her mother had been alive to soften the spaces between his words. He said he was glad she was well, and that he hoped to meet Ralph Barker one day. She taught school throughout October and November with the focused joy of someone doing exactly the right work. The 17 children of Harlan's Crossing were making progress that was visible and measurable, and she tracked it in her record book with the satisfaction of someone who understands that the best work is slow and steady and accumulates like interest. Clarence Crane's reading had improved dramatically. She had simply discovered that he learned better with his hands involved, and had started having him trace the letters in a tray of sand before copying them on his slate, and something in that kinetic engagement had unlocked the mechanism. She and Ralph saw each other every Saturday for the drive and frequently during the week when he was in town for supplies, and the courtship deepened into something that both of them knew, without requiring discussion, was already past the stage of courtship and into the stage of simply being two people whose lives were thoroughly intertwined. He showed her the ranch properly one Saturday in October, driving her out across the 400 acres in the crisp autumn air. The wheat field on the east quarter had been harvested and stood in cut stubble under a pewter sky, and the cattle Hereford crosses mostly, with a few good Longhorn bloodlines still in the herd for hardiness, moved slow and solid in the near pasture. The ranch house itself was a low, solid structure of Kansas limestone with 4 rooms and a covered porch that faced south, and when she walked through it, she did not see what it was but what it could be, which was an instinct she had always had about spaces. "The kitchen is practical but dark," she said, standing in it, tipping her head. "If you put a window in the east wall, it would catch the morning light." He looked at the east wall with the expression of a man who had not previously thought about morning light as a variable. "I could do that," he said. "And the porch," she said, walking out onto it. "In spring and summer this would be the best room in the house." He stood beside her on the porch, looking south over the land. "It would be the best room in the house in most seasons," he said, "with the right company." She turned and looked at him, and the autumn wind moved through the cottonwood at the corner of the house, and the light was the particular gold of a Kansas October afternoon, and she thought with a fullness that was almost startling, "This is the place. This is the actual specific place I am going to live my life." "Yes," she said, though he hadn't asked a question. He looked at her and understood her perfectly, which was, she thought, the purest form of love, not the dazzle of the beginning but the particular peace of being understood. They set the wedding for the 2nd Saturday of November, which gave them 6 weeks to prepare and gave the town enough time to plan the celebration it was clearly itching to have. Mrs. Ida Perkins took charge of the reception supper with an organizational capability that Delia found both impressive and slightly overwhelming. Loretta Crane volunteered to make the wedding cake, 3 layers, white with a lemon curd filling, because Delia had mentioned in passing that she loved lemon and Loretta had stored this information for exactly this purpose. Reverend Calhoun dusted off his best sermons on the subject of covenant and devoted 2 weeks of Bible study to it as preparation, which the congregation found spiritually useful and personally entertaining. Delia made her own wedding dress, which was practical since she was an excellent seamstress, and the nearest dressmaker was in Wichita. She made it from ivory cotton sateen she ordered from Abe Fletcher's catalog, simple in cut, with long sleeves for the November weather and a small row of buttons at the wrist that had belonged to her mother, saved in a tin for years and finally finding their use. When she was finished and tried it on in her room at the boarding house with Mrs. Perkins watching from the doorway, Mrs. Perkins said, "My lord, girl," which Delia took as the highest possible endorsement. The day of the wedding arrived cold and clear, the sky a winter blue above the white steeple of the church. The whole of Harlan's Crossing turned out, every family, most of the surrounding farms, people Delia hadn't met yet who had heard and come anyway, because a wedding in a small town is a communal occasion that belongs to everyone. The church was packed with the warmth of bodies and the smell of candle wax, and the cedar boughs that someone had thought to hang above the windows. Ralph was standing at the front of the church when she came in on Reverend Calhoun's arm. He had offered when he understood she had no one else to do it, and she had accepted with gratitude. Ralph was wearing his good black coat and a white shirt she had not seen before, and a dark blue cravat that Milo had clearly helped him with, and that was slightly crooked on the right side, which made her love him so precisely in that moment that she had to breathe carefully. He watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was utterly open and unguarded and completely unable to pretend to be anything other than what it was, a man looking at the person he loved. She reached him. He took her hand. Reverend Calhoun opened his Bible and began, and the church was very quiet. They said their vows in the clear, straightforward language of the 1882 Kansas frontier, without flourish, meaning every word. When Reverend Calhoun declared them husband and wife and Ralph kissed her briefly, warmly, with the particular quality of a man who was fully present and had no interest in performing anything for an audience. The church erupted in the kind of spontaneous collective sound that small communities make when something genuinely good has happened to people they care about. The reception supper at the Masonic Hall was everything Mrs. Perkins had promised and more. Loretta's cake was perfect. Pete Dawson produced a fiddle from nowhere and turned out to be so good at it that Ralph shot Delia a look of vindicated satisfaction across the room that made her laugh out loud. There was dancing, which was enthusiastic rather than graceful, and food enough for twice the number of people, and enough good fellowship to carry the evening well into the cold night. Ralph danced with her 3 times and was not, she discovered, a particularly accomplished dancer, which she had not expected and found perfectly charming. He was too tall for it and too accustomed to moving through space with practical purpose rather than decorative rhythm, and he apologized for stepping on her foot, which made her pull him back when he started to create space between them. "I don't mind," she said, and meant it in all directions. They drove home to the ranch in the wagon under a sky full of stars, bundled in blankets, the horse's breath making small clouds in the cold air, the land dark and enormous around them. She sat beside him with her shoulder against his and his arm around her shoulders, and the silence between them was the very best kind, complete and warm and full of everything that didn't need to be said because it was already known. The ranch house was lit by the lamp Ralph had left burning low in the front room, and when they came inside, it smelled of wood smoke from the fire he had banked that morning, and she stood in the kitchen that she had already begun to think of as her own, and felt the particular settledness of a person who has arrived, after considerable difficulty, exactly where they belong. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and close, and the happiest stretch of time Delia could recall. The school closed for the worst weeks of December and January. The children couldn't walk the distances in the bitter cold, and she spent those weeks in the ranch house, learning the rhythms of a life she had not expected and finding that it fit her with the comfortable precision of something made for her specifically. She kept the books for the ranch, taking over from the system Ralph had maintained in a somewhat optimistic ledger and bringing it into proper order. She discovered that the cattle operation was profitable but narrow-margined, and that with some adjustments to the winter feeding schedule and a slightly different arrangement with the buyer in Wichita, she could improve the margin appreciably, which she worked out on paper over 3 evenings and presented to Ralph at the kitchen table. He read through her calculations twice, asked 2 precise and intelligent questions, and then said, You're right. Let's do it. She had expected, based on everything she knew about men and business, a longer argument. The absence of one was so satisfying that she almost didn't know what to do with it. She went back to the school in February when the weather eased, driving herself in the small one-horse buggy Ralph had acquired and fitted with a proper weatherboard for winter trips. The children returned with the energy of young animals released from confinement, and the schoolroom was briefly chaotic in the best way, a chaos of excitement, and catching up that settled within 2 days into the productive rhythm she had established in September. Clarence Crane read his first full primer through without stopping in March, which made Delia press her lips together very tightly and look out the window for a moment while the other children applauded. When she told Ralph that evening, his face did something so warm and proud that she understood he had known Clarence all the boy's short life and cared about him as something close to family. In the spring, Ralph began building the east window in the kitchen that she had mentioned in October. He did it himself over 3 Saturdays, with Milo's help on the framing, and when the window was finally set and the light came through it for the first time on a clear April morning and fell across the kitchen table in a long, warm rectangle, she stood in it and said nothing at all, and Ralph stood in the doorway watching her stand in it and said nothing either, and the silence was the fullest kind. April brought also a piece of news that she delivered to Ralph one morning over breakfast, quietly, watching his face. She was expecting a child. He went entirely still for one long moment. Then he pushed back his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was so careful and complete that she had to press her face against his shoulder because she didn't want him to see that she was crying, which was foolish since he certainly felt it. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "Perfectly," she said, which was true. He held her for a long time at the kitchen table in the morning light while the coffee went cold and the sun moved across the floor. The summer of 1883 was good to the ranch. The cattle prices held, the wheat came in strong, and the east window in the kitchen became, as Delia had predicted, the heart of the house, the place where she sat in the mornings with her coffee and her lesson preparations, where Ralph came in from the early chores and leaned against the frame and told her what the sky looked like, where the cats that had appeared from nowhere and attached themselves to the ranch house slept in the rectangle of sunlight with the particular authority of cats who have decided they live somewhere. Delia taught through July, then arranged with the school board to take the autumn term off when the baby came, with the understanding that she would return in January, and that Mrs. Calhoun, the Reverend's wife, who had some teaching experience and was happy to have a project, would manage the classroom in the interim. The school board agreed readily, having discovered that Delia Doyle Barker was not a person you wanted to lose from your school if you could avoid it. The baby came in late September, arriving with the decisive speed of someone who had been waiting long enough. Ralph stayed beside her throughout the whole of it, which in 1883 was not universally the practice, but he had made it plain that he intended to be present, and no one who knew him well was particularly surprised by this. The doctor, young Calloway, managed the medical particulars with competent calm. Loretta Crane was there too, steady and experienced and exactly the right person to have in the room. The baby was a boy, born at 5 in the morning with a head of dark hair and the vigorous objections to the outside world that indicated he was in excellent health. They named him James Thomas Barker, James for Ralph's father and Thomas for no one in particular, except that it suited him. When Ralph held his son for the first time, standing in the lamplight of the bedroom at the ranch house he had built on Kansas land he had worked 8 years to make his own, with his wife watching from the bed with an exhausted and absolute happiness, something in his face was so utterly undone and remade that she would remember it for the rest of her life. Harlan's Crossing received the news of the baby with the collective delight of a community that has genuinely adopted a person as its own. Mrs. Perkins appeared within 48 hours with a quilt she had apparently been making in secret for months, executed in a complex pattern of blue and cream that she declared entirely casual, as if she had simply had the fabric lying around. Loretta brought food for a week. Reverend Calhoun came to meet the newest parishioner of the church and declared him a fine specimen, which James demonstrated by immediately going to sleep on the Reverend's shoulder, with the confidence of someone who knows a comfortable resting place when he finds one. Delia was back in the school by January as she had planned, bringing James with her for the nursing hours and leaving him with Loretta for the rest of the day, an arrangement that suited everyone and that James accepted with the adaptable good nature that appeared to be his primary characteristic. The children were delighted to have him in the schoolroom for his brief appearances. Clarence Crane, now reading at the level of a child 2 years his senior, held him with solemn care and read aloud to him from the primer, which was touching enough to make the older girls pretend they hadn't noticed. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not slowly, but fully, each one distinct and real. By 1885, the ranch had expanded to 560 acres, a piece of land to the east having come available that Ralph bought after 2 seasons of improved cattle margins that Delia's accounting adjustments had made possible. She did not say, "I told you so" about the margin improvements, because she was not that kind of person, but she did allow herself a private, satisfied moment at the ledger. In the spring of 1885, a second child arrived, a girl this time, born in May with lighter coloring than her brother and an expression, right from the first days, of a person making careful observations and withholding final conclusions. They named her Margaret Rose, after Ralph's mother and Delia's own. Margaret Rose was a different creature from James from the start. Where he was vigorous and demonstrative, she was watchful and precise, and it was clear by the time she could toddle across the kitchen floor that she was going to be, in Delia's considered assessment, either a scientist or a lawyer, possibly both. The school board offered Delia a new contract in 1886 at an improved salary, having noted that the children of Harlan's Crossing were testing above the county average, which had attracted favorable attention from the district superintendent in Wichita. She accepted with the quiet pleasure of a person who has earned recognition they didn't go looking for. Ralph hired a third hand that year, a young man named Eli who came out from Missouri the way Ralph himself had once done, with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work. Ralph saw something in him and gave him a chance, which was the kind of thing Ralph did so naturally and consistently that people who observed it tended to simply call it his character, which it was. Eli turned out to be excellent with horses and learnable about everything else, and within a year he was as necessary to the operation as Milo or Pete. One evening in the summer of 1886, Delia and Ralph sat on the south porch after supper, the porch she had called the best room in the house, which it remained, with the children asleep inside, and the land going dark around them and the first stars coming out above the horizon. James was 4 years old, sturdy and loud and passionately interested in everything mechanical, particularly the workings of the windmill at the south water tank. Margaret was 1.5 and currently of the opinion, held with considerable force, that she would determine her own bedtime. Delia had her feet up on the porch railing, which was not ladylike, and which she had stopped caring about approximately 8 months into living on a cattle ranch. Ralph had his arm along the back of the bench they sat on, his hand resting light and warm at her shoulder. "I think about that train platform sometimes," she said. Not for any particular reason, the thought had simply arrived, the way thoughts sometimes do at the end of quiet days. "Do you?" His voice was easy and attentive in the dark. "The moment I read that sign, Harlan's Crossing," she paused. "I was so frightened. I thought my life had come completely apart." He was quiet for a moment. The windmill at the south tank turned slowly against the darkening sky, a sound like a deep, slow breath. "What do you think now?" he said. She leaned her head back against his arm and looked up at the stars that were coming out thick and vivid now, the summer sky of Kansas dense with them. She thought about the train and the heat and the wrong stop, and the man who had been standing at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, with nothing in his face but genuine concern for a stranger in difficulty. She thought about the walk to the telegraph office, and the wildflowers that were slightly wilted, and the east window in the kitchen, and James learning to say the word windmill with 3 distinct and serious syllables, and Margaret's expression of forensic assessment, and the ledger that balanced cleanly, and the schoolroom where 17 children had become 22, and the sound of this man's breathing in the dark beside her every night for 4 years. "I think," she said, "that the train took me exactly where I needed to go." He turned his head and looked at her in the starlight, and she felt rather than saw the smile, the full one, the real one, and he drew her a little closer with the arm behind her shoulders, and they sat together in the best room of the house, while the Kansas night settled over the land they had made their own. The summer passed, and autumn came in gold and russet, the cottonwood along the creek turning the color Ralph had described to her that first Saturday drive, visible from the school on clear days exactly as he had said it would be. James started school in September of 1887, appearing on the first morning with Ralph's solemn deliberateness and Delia's straight spine, and the combined effect being a boy who walked into the schoolroom his mother taught with an expression of someone who has come to take the matter very seriously indeed. This presented a unique challenge for Delia, who had always separated her professional and personal selves with precision, and a unique delight for the other children, who found the situation endlessly interesting. She managed it the only way she could, by holding James to the same standard as every other student, no more and no less, and letting the chips fall. He accepted this with what she privately recognized as Ralph's quality of simply getting on with things, and by November he was reading well and had made 3 close friends, and had shown Clarence Crane something useful about the mechanism of the desk hinges, which Clarence had applied to further inquiries about other mechanical objects in the schoolroom. The winter of 1887 brought a hard blizzard in February that kept the school closed for 3 weeks and kept the ranch operation down to survival essentials. Ralph and Milo and Pete and Eli taking turns through the brutal cold, making sure the cattle had feed and water, and didn't drift into the fences in the whiteouts that came off the north. Delia managed the house, and the children with the focused calm she brought to any emergency, keeping the stove going and the food organized, and the children occupied with lessons conducted informally at the kitchen table. When Ralph came in from the cold each day, she met him at the door with hot coffee and dry socks, and whatever warmth she had been keeping against his return, and the particular relief in his face each time made something in her chest go fierce and steady. They lost 4 head of cattle in the worst 3 days of the blizzard. Ralph said so at the supper table without dwelling on it, and Delia noted the number in the ledger and made the calculations about what it cost and what it could be recovered and said, "We'll make it up by June," which they did. In the spring of 1888, Delia discovered she was expecting a 3rd child, which she told Ralph on the south porch in the warm April evening in the way that had become theirs, quietly watching his face, with the full knowledge that what she would see there was worth watching for. His response was the same each time, the stillness, then the warmth, then the arms around her. He was, she had decided definitively, the most consistent person she had ever known, and she meant it as the highest possible praise. The 3rd child was another boy, born in October of 1888, healthy and vigorous from the first hour. They named him William Arthur Barker, though within 2 weeks everyone called him Will, and within a month it was clear that Will had come into the world with a temperament so sunny and uncomplicated that even Margaret, who generally regarded new variables with suspicion, approved of him. By 1889, the ranch employed 4 hands including Eli, ran 300 head of cattle, had the east window Ralph had built, and 2 more improvements Delia had conceived, and Ralph had executed. A proper root cellar that kept their winter stores immaculate, and a covered walkway between the house and the barn that made the morning chores dramatically more survivable in bad weather. The school in Harlan's Crossing had 25 students and a reputation in the Wichita district that brought the superintendent out twice a year to observe, which Delia found mildly tedious, but accepted as a necessary feature of doing work well in a public capacity. Reverend Calhoun, who had married them 7 years before, retired in the spring of 1889 and was replaced by a younger man named Reverend Ash, who had come from Ohio and was still getting used to the wind. Calhoun came to the ranch to say goodbye before leaving to live with his daughter in Topeka, and he sat at Delia's kitchen table in the east window light and had coffee, and said that of all the things he had done in Harlan's Crossing, marrying them had been among the ones he was most pleased with, which made Ralph reach across the table and shake his hand, and made Delia refill his coffee cup 3 times without being asked. Milo Crane's eldest son, Samuel, started school in 1890, and Delia saw in him, at 6 years old, the same gift for mathematics she had seen in Clarence, differently shaped, broader rather than deep, the kind of mind that would do well at engineering if anyone ever gave it the opportunity. She wrote a letter to the district superintendent about the subject of secondary education access for rural Kansas children, and received a polite reply that she filed and considered a beginning rather than an end. The autumn of 1890 brought the school's best results yet. 3 of her older students took the county examination for further schooling, and all 3 passed, which was unprecedented for Harlan's Crossing, and which the Wichita District newspaper mentioned in a small item that Abe Fletcher cut out of his copy and put up in the dry goods store window. Ralph showed her the clipping one evening at the kitchen table, sliding it across to her without comment. She read it and looked up at him. He was watching her with the particular expression she had learned to read over 8 years, the pride he felt for her that he never reduced to excess but never hid either. "It's just an item," she said. "It's true," he said. "That's what makes it worth reading." She folded it and put it in the small wooden box on her dressing table where she kept things she wanted to remember, alongside her mother's button tin and the first letter Ralph had sent her, not a formal letter, just a note he had left at the boarding house after their second Saturday drive, saying simply, "I find I am thinking about the argument we had about the piano sonata. I believe I may need to hear one before I concede the point. If you know of any opportunity for that, I am willing to consider it." She had written back that she intended to find a piano and settle the matter definitively, and she had, eventually, through the instrument at the church, where she sat with Ralph on a Tuesday evening when the church was empty, and played him the opening of a Beethoven sonata she had memorized in Cincinnati, and he had listened with complete attention, and then said, after a long pause, that he was prepared to revise his position. The fiddle was still, in his estimation, the more honest instrument for this particular landscape, but he was willing to acknowledge that the piano was doing something the fiddle could not do, and that both things could be true simultaneously. She had considered this a significant intellectual concession, and had felt, in that moment, that she was in love with his mind as thoroughly as everything else. November of 1890 marked 8 years since she had stepped off the train at Caldwell Station and stood on the platform of Harlan's Crossing in the August heat with her carpet bag and her confusion and her $43, and found Ralph Barker standing at the platform edge with his hat in his hands and nothing in his expression but patient, unhurried concern. She thought about it on the anniversary, as she sometimes did, with the fullness of someone who has had enough time to understand what might have been different. If she had stayed awake on the train, if she had woken at the right stop, if Gerald Holt in Millbrook had been the kind of man who waited, she thought about that too, sometimes, with no bitterness but with the clarity of a woman who knows her own worth. She would have arrived in Millbrook to find a man who had hired a wife rather than hoped for one, and she would have been competent and sensible and probably fine, in the way that people who are competent and sensible are often fine in circumstances that do not quite fit them. Instead, she was here, at this table, in this light, with these 3 children asleep in their rooms and this man across from her in the evening, reading the agricultural report from Wichita with his reading glasses on glasses he had acquired last winter and wore with an occasional grumbling dignity, and his feet on the rungs of the kitchen chair the way he always sat when he was comfortable and not thinking about it. She watched him read and thought about the particular gift of knowing someone so thoroughly that their habits are not merely familiar but beloved. The way he turned pages from the bottom corner, the way he sometimes murmured a word or a number from the page, as if hearing it helped him understand it, the way he looked up occasionally and met her eyes across the table with the automatic ease of someone checking in on the most important thing in the room. "What are you thinking about?" he asked without looking up from the page. 8 years, she said. He looked up then, and the glasses gave him a slightly professorial air that she was fond of. He looked at her steadily for a moment. 8 years, he repeated, and his voice had the weight of the thing. "I was thinking about the platform," she said. He set the report down. "I was so afraid of being forward," he said. "You were clearly a woman of quality and you'd had a terrible afternoon, and I didn't want to be the next difficulty. I almost just pointed you at the telegraph office and said goodbye." She blinked. "I didn't know that. I stood at the back of my wagon for about 30 seconds arguing with myself about it," he said, and the small, careful smile appeared. "Common sense won, barely," she laughed. "Common sense in this case was the bravest thing." "It didn't feel brave," he said. "It felt like I was going to kick myself for the rest of my life if I didn't at least ask whether you were all right." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the east window light, the window he had built because she had mentioned once that the kitchen was dark, and thought about all the small particular decisions that had added up to this. His common sense winning, barely. Her falling asleep on the train. The sign above the platform. Every thread of it had to have been exactly as it was, or none of it would have arrived here. "Then I am very grateful," she said, "to your common sense." He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had the first evening he had said her name with that particular quality of care. She turned her hand and held his back, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said, which was the truest kind of love, not the kind that fills silences, but the kind that makes them comfortable to live in. James and Margaret and Will grew as children do, faster than seems quite fair, with the accelerating speed of each passing year. By 1892, James was 10 and deeply interested in the working of the ranch, following Ralph through the operations with the focused apprentice energy of a boy who intends to be useful and is already becoming so. Margaret, at 7, had declared her intention to be a doctor, an announcement made at the dinner table with the forensic certainty of someone who has already decided and is merely informing the relevant parties. Ralph had said without hesitation that he didn't see why she shouldn't, which had made Delia love him, if such a thing were possible, more than she had at the previous measurement. Will, at 4, was primarily interested in horses and the philosophical question of why rules existed. The school in Harlan's Crossing had become, under Delia's decade of leadership, something genuinely notable in the Kansas district, a school that sent children forward with real knowledge and real curiosity and real confidence in their own capacity to learn. She had stopped counting the number of former students who had gone on to further study or to professions that would not have been accessible without what they had been given in that small limestone schoolroom. It was not a small number. In the spring of 1892, a letter arrived from the district superintendent offering Delia the position of district education supervisor, which would have meant leaving Harlan's Crossing and the school and the ranch. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at the east window and thought about it carefully for 2 days before declining. She wrote back a thoughtful and detailed letter explaining that she believed the greatest value she could provide was in this specific classroom with these specific children, and that she hoped the district would focus its supervisory attention on ensuring that every rural schoolteacher in Kansas had access to the training and resources that made real teaching possible. The superintendent replied that her point was well taken and that he intended to pursue a training program on exactly those lines, which she considered a satisfactory outcome. When she told Ralph she had turned it down, he looked at her carefully. "Was that what you wanted?" he said. "Not what was practical or what I might have preferred. Was it what you wanted?" She considered the question with the respect it deserved. "Yes," she said. "The school is where my work is. I know it to my bones." He nodded once, the nod that meant he had taken the answer and believed it. "All right then," he said. It was, she thought, exactly what her father had never quite managed to say to her, simply taking her word for what she knew about herself. The years settled further, each one distinct and good, threaded through with the ordinary, extraordinary material of a life fully lived. Ralph's hair began to go gray at the temples in 1893, which she told him looked distinguished, which he disputed without conviction. She found 3 silver threads in her own dark hair in the spring of 1894, which she discovered in the mirror at the washstand, and reported to him that evening with great equanimity. He said they were beautiful, which was so completely and transparently sincere that she had nothing to do with the comment except believe it, which she did. James at 12 could ride and rope and manage the cattle in the north pasture, and was beginning to understand the economics of the operation in a way that reminded Delia of herself at the ledger 8 years prior, the same instinct for where the numbers told the true story. She had begun teaching him bookkeeping in the evenings, and he approached it with the combination of Ralph's patience and her own precision that was, she thought, a reasonably good inheritance from both directions. Margaret at 9 had borrowed every medical text she could locate from the Wichita catalog and the Dr. Calloway's shelf, and was reading them with the comprehensive intentionality of someone conducting a research program. Calloway himself, who had been in Harlan's Crossing now for over a decade and no longer seemed startled by dust storms, had begun allowing her to ask him questions on Saturday mornings, which had turned into an informal tutorial that both parties found extremely satisfying. Will at 6 was discovering that reading opened the same door for him that mechanical understanding had opened for Clarence Crane. Once the key turned, everything became possible. He read with the appetite of someone who has discovered a new landscape, and his favorites were adventure stories, and the natural history books that Delia ordered in from Wichita and left on the kitchen table where they were reliably consumed. In the summer of 1894, Loretta and Milo Crane celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a supper at their house to which Ralph and Delia were invited, along with Pete and his wife Clara and Eli, who had married a woman from the neighboring town named Frances, a sharp and cheerful person whom Delia liked very much. They sat around Loretta's long table in the warm July evening and ate well and talked freely and laughed often, and Delia looked around the table at these people who had simply been her neighbors, and were now as close as family in the way that Western frontier communities built their own versions of kinship out of proximity and shared difficulty and years of simply being there for each other, and felt the completeness of it in a way that was almost too large for the room. Clarence Crane, now 17, had been accepted to a school in Wichita for technical training in engineering and was leaving in September. He came to the schoolhouse one afternoon the week before he left and sat in his old seat at the desk he had occupied for years and told Delia that he wanted to thank her for the sand tray. She had to think for a moment before she remembered the tray of sand she had devised when he was 8 and struggling with reading, having him trace the letters with his finger in the sand before copying them on the slate. He remembered it with the specificity that people reserve for things that changed their direction. She told him that the sand tray was his, and that he had done the actual work, and that she expected she would be hearing very good things about him from Wichita. He shook her hand with the careful seriousness of a young man practicing the formal version of himself, and then walked back down the road toward his family's house, and she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched him go with the particular kind of pride that belongs to teachers and no one else. September of 1895 was 13 years since the train had deposited Delia Doyle on the platform of Harlan's Crossing by mistake. The ranch was solid and prospering. The school was the best in the district. James was 13 and already the size of the man he would be, with Ralph's breadth and Delia's eyes. Margaret was 11 and had decided that her medical training would begin in earnest at 16 when she would arrange to study with a physician in Wichita, a plan she presented to her parents at supper one evening with a written outline. Delia and Ralph had read the outline without comment and then looked at each other across the table, and Ralph had said, "I think that's a reasonable plan," which Margaret had recorded in her notebook as parental approval obtained. Will was 7 and reading everything and beginning, with Delia's quiet encouragement, to write little observations and stories that he left on the kitchen table for his parents to find, written in the careful, clear hand she had taught him, and full of the kind of noticing that good writers do from childhood. On the evening of the anniversary, Delia and Ralph sat on the south porch as they did in every good season, in the bench that had become their place over 13 years of evenings. The children were inside, James working on the ranch accounts with the focused diligence of someone who considers this his actual job, Margaret reading a medical text, Will writing in his notebook with a stub of pencil and the concentration of the already committed. The stars were out thick and brilliant, the Kansas sky at its magnificent excess. A coyote called somewhere far in the north, a sound that Delia had found eerie in her first months here, and had long since come to find simply part of the landscape's voice. Ralph's arm was around her shoulders. She was leaning into him with the complete and unguarded ease of a person who has inhabited this particular configuration for long enough that it is simply the shape of comfort. 13 years, he said. I know, she said. Do you remember what you said on the porch around the 3rd year, that the train took you exactly where you needed to go? I remember, she said. I think about that sometimes, he said, and his voice was very quiet. How close it came to not happening. You sleeping past that stop, all of it. It frightens me when I think about it too directly, she said honestly, so I generally think about it obliquely. He pulled her a little closer. I know what I had before you got here, he said. I don't think about it a great deal, but I know it. And I know what I've had since. And there isn't a word in the English language that adequately covers the difference. She turned her head and looked at him in the starlight. This man who had been standing at the edge of a train platform 13 years ago with his hat in his hands, and who had, by the narrow margin of his own common sense winning a 30-second internal argument, offered his help to a stranger who had arrived in the wrong town on a hot August afternoon. There might not be a word, she said, but I think we know what it is. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen on the day he held their firstborn son, that undone and remade quality, the face of a person too full of something real to manage a composed expression, and he said, very simply, Yes, we do. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the south porch of the house they had made their own, under the enormous Kansas sky, while inside their children occupied themselves with the serious work of becoming who they were going to be, and the land stretched wide and dark and honest in every direction, making none of its usual apologies, and the stars were uncountable. And the night was full of the coyote's distant voice, and the slow turning of the windmill at the south tank, and the sound of 2 people breathing in the dark beside each other, which was not a small thing, and had never been, and would not be for as long as the stars held. The morning would come the way mornings always did on the Kansas plains, sudden and bright and already warm. the sky going from black to that deep specific blue that Delia had come to love above all other blues. And Ralph would be up before her as he always was, starting the stove and going out for the first check of the cattle, and she would come downstairs to the smell of coffee and find the east window full of early light, and the day would begin in the ordinary, extraordinary way that the best days do. And it would go on like that, season after season, year after year, the ranch growing stronger and the school growing its children and the children growing themselves, and the two of them at the center of it all, growing into each other the way trees sometimes do when planted close roots intertwined beneath the surface, branches meeting overhead, the whole structure stronger for the closeness than either would have been alone. It was, as it had always been, exactly where she was supposed to be.